To welcome you for this afternoon session looking at ethics, risk and regulation in AI. Thanks very much for joining us. And I'd just like to hand over to Jen, who's the panel chair. Hope you have a good discussion this afternoon.
Great. Thank you very much. Can you all hear me okay? And I'm hoping that you digitally, virtually can hear me as well. Oh, it's gotten louder. That's reassuring. So thank you for that kind introduction, and welcome everyone to this afternoon's panel on ethics, risk and regulation in AI, where we'll be exploring the issues associated with regulating artificial intelligence and mitigating risks associated with its use. We're joined virtually by Dr. Ansgar Kühne, Global AI Ethics and Regulatory Leader at Ernst & Young. Ernst & Young have carried out significant research in the area of risk assessment and artificial intelligence, and our panel will discuss the findings, including the complexity of the issue and the various methodologies involved, and then consider the interaction between these technical solutions and regulation. We're also joined by Callum Sinclair, Partner, Head of Technology and Commercial at Burness Paul LLP, and by Carolyn Jameson, Chief Trust Officer at Trustpilot. Together, the panel will discuss how legislators and other bodies have attempted to balance the challenges of fostering innovation against mitigating risks to the public, and what the future may hold in both the UK and further afield, in a brief 45 minutes. I also wanted to say to you that I'm a bit of a novice in this area of work, not a scientist or an industry expert, but founder of a human rights law firm and a lawyer who at the moment is a happy bystander, primarily interested in better understanding the evolving face of regulation in an area that I have no doubt will only grow in significance in our lives year on year. In working with the panel and taking the opportunity to learn more about their work, I've been impressed by the huge amount of work that has gone into a deep and honest reflection on those challenges, but also the challenge of trying to create a regulatory framework in an area of almost limitless potential future developments. Lawyers, unlike philosophers and mathematicians, work so much better retrospectively rather than prospectively. It's just one of those lawyer things. So I think that that's what we're here to look at today. Regulation of novel technologies has often fallen short because of two key perceptions. Either regulators do not seem to understand the industries of the technology that they are regulating, or they do not seem to be regulating in the public interest, and hence not exercising appropriate authority. It almost doesn't seem to matter whether these are true and evidenced or just perception. I think we can all think of examples where regulatory regimes have been undermined by either or both. So as I understand it, we're not quite at ground zero in building frameworks for the ethical global regulation of AI, but we are clearly at the start of a journey. And we're hopeful that today's panel will be a step towards engaging those issues. First, how can we ensure that AI regulation in its form and substance is continuously informed by industry expertise? And second, how do we ensure that regulation maintains credibility and legitimacy, that it's seen to be and it operates, in fact, in the public interest and in a way that is ethical, inclusive, and trustworthy, as I'm told are our goals today. So with that, I'd like to hand over to Dr. Ansgar Kühne, who, as I said, is the Global AI Ethics and Regulatory Leader at Ernst & Young, where he leads the AI-related public policy team and contributes to the work on AI governance at Ernst & Young's trusted AI framework. Ansgar will be presenting the findings and conclusions of the Ernst & Young's recent research just mentioned on risk assessment and artificial intelligence. Over to you, Ansgar.
Thank you very much. It's great to be with everybody virtually. Unfortunately, I couldn't be with you in person due to a recent COVID situation with myself. So I wanted to start this panel just with a brief overview of the work that we've done to survey the approaches to AI risk assessment, really, that we are seeing being taken at various national regulatory kind of initiatives, but also within the industry. So first of all, the motivating factor for why we went into this work is because we are seeing across the globe that AI is being seen as something that needs to be regulated, but also something that has a lot of potential to help society. And as such, the approach that is generally being taken is to say we do not want to regulate all AI to the same extent, but rather we want to recognize that some applications of AI pose potential risks to society or to individuals, whereas other applications do not. And so we should be adjusting the level of compliance requirements accordingly. There's no need to heavily burden industries' innovation in AI in areas where there is no particular risk that is being posed to people or society. We see this, for instance, as a foundation for the EU's AI Act, but also we see this in discussions in the US around potential approaches to AI regulation in the UK when thinking about, for instance, the AI assurance framework that is being conceptualized at this moment. One challenge, however, is that this high-level thinking of, okay, we should be doing a risk-based approach doesn't clarify how do we assess risk? What is it that will define whether something will fall into a high-risk category that requires a high level of regulatory compliance versus not falling in that kind of category? If we look at the AI Act, for instance, the approach has been to effectively define a list of possible use cases. And while I don't think that people generally have a large disagreement with the list that has been proposed, it isn't really clear what is the fundamental basis for how this list was drawn up. There's a certain flavor to it of a brainstorming session among regulators identifying, well, public sector uses is probably something that's going to be high risk. Law enforcement seems like something high risk. We should put that on the list. But what is the fundamental basis for approaching a risk assessment for AI in order to do this kind of classification? We see activity happening at the OECD, for instance, around how to classify AI systems, not purely as risk-based classification, but more generally. And there's the debate, for instance, to what extent should the technical properties of the AI system, the level of transparency, for instance, are you using deep learning or something else that might be less opaque? Should that be a factor that features in whether something is high risk or not, or should it purely be based on, well, if you're using something in the medical domain, it's probably more risky than if you're using it in computer games. So we basically ran a survey looking at the approaches that are being taken across a number of countries, including the EU, US, Canada, China, Germany, Singapore, as well as international organizations such as the OECD, the Global Partnership on AI, GPI, UNESCO, the Council of Europe, standard-setting organizations, which are playing an increasingly important role also to help regulators understand what are the issues, but also to provide industry with the basis of how to, a guidance as to what does good practice look like. So we looked at what is happening at the ISO IEC initiatives, at IEEE, at the NIST and Senelec, as well as industry approaches in the financial sector, risk management sector. How are the big tech firms approaching this? And what are some of the leading publications from academia and NGO that we see being referenced? So just to summarize, first of all, what I think from an industry perspective is certainly a promising approach is that we do see most of these risk assessments referring back to things like the national AI principles that have been published, which luckily are largely aligned across the globe. So that gives us an initial point of reference. We also identify that most risk-based approaches look to differentiating between 3 to 5 levels of risks in order to be able to make the kind of level of categorization that is useful for regulation, but is not too difficult to come to a decision which category you should be falling into. But what is sort of not yet completely clarified, crystallized, is the risk factors that should be coming into this. What is the objective analysis? Is it the complete system that the AI is the component of, or is it the AI component in itself? Think, for instance, in an autonomous vehicle, is the risk determined by the fact that it is in a vehicle, or is the risk determined by whether or not it is the AI that is driving the brakes or a different component of the vehicle? The other element is, what is the nature of the risk? And so with nature of the risk, we mean, is it a risk in the sense of an ethical risk? Is it the risk in the sense of a security risk? Is it a risk related to challenges for implementing governance? Those kinds of factors. And then finally, what is the metric of severity? Is it the level of impact on fundamental rights? Is it the frequency of use of the system? Or is it the number of people that are being affected by it because of basically the width of how many people are using the system? Is it the irreversibility of the harm that might happen? So if a direct physical harm or killing somebody is not reversible, whereas if it's a financial harm, it may be more easily reversible. So these are some of the core questions that actually haven't really been answered yet. There is no clear consensus as to which of these factors should be contributing how much. And so we are hoping to stimulate a discussion and more fundamental thinking on these aspects.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ansgar, for that brief contribution. And I should have said at the start, this would have been a better approach to chairing, that the format of today will be for the panel members to each give a brief overview of 5 to 8 minutes, and then we'll open out for a good sort of 20-minute Q&A session. So if I can ask you to hold your questions just for now. I'd like to turn now to introduce Callum Sinclair, who's Head of Technology and Commercial at Burness Poll, where he's worked in the field of information and communications technology law for over 20 years and has a lifelong passion for technology. He specializes in a broad range of technology and sourcing projects for clients on both customer and supply side, acting for some of the world's largest technology businesses, principally in the regulated industries, financial services, fintech, and public sectors. And Callum is now going to be speaking about the current regulatory landscape and exploring some of the early decisions to be made about the form, substance, and timing of cross-border regulation of AI.
Thanks very much, Jen. Can everybody hear me okay? Yeah, and thanks to Ansgar as well. I'm almost disappointed that he's not on one of these little pedestals on a screen that sort of wheels its way around the room. I think that would be, we've definitely got to do that next time. So the Euai survey in the focus highlights the importance of AI risk assessments and picks out legal and regulatory levers as one key mechanism for managing the risk of AI. But lawmakers have got some catching up to do, as Jen mentioned, and AI systems are already everywhere in a large number of sectors. And whilst there are a plethora of AI reports, consultations, and principles that exist globally already, there's much less by way of enforceable regulation. There are snippets here and there in force aimed at, for example, automated systems. Article 22 of UK and EU GDPR protects the rights of individuals against decisions based solely on automated processing and profiling, for example. And there are also established broad legal concepts in most legal systems that can be stretched to fit new technological developments, though this can have unpredictable results. The recent report of the Law Commissions of Scotland and England on criminal and civil liability for automated vehicles causing damage or injury is a good example of that, where recommendations are for specific updates to the law to recognise manufacturer and service operator liability. Draft laws are coming. The AI Index is an annual study of AI impact and progress at the Stanford Institute for Human-Centered Artificial Intelligence. And according to the 2022 AI Index, published earlier this month, and taking the United States as an example, the US has seen a sharp increase in the number of proposed bills related to AI. Lawmakers proposed 130 laws in 2021 compared with just one in 2015. Having said that, the number of bills that actually passed remains low, with only 2% ultimately becoming law in the past 6 years. The 2022 AI Index also notes that globally since 2015, 18 times more bills related to AI were passed into law in legislatures of 25 countries around the world, and mentions of AI in legislative proceedings also grew by almost 8 times in the past 6 years. There'll be a lot more to come, and it's generally thought that much of that will be based on the OECD AI principles, which you've heard referenced a couple of times today, following their endorsement by the G20, including fairness, transparency, explainability, robustness, security, safety, and accountability. And this and the formation of the Global Partnership on AI, now 25 member countries strong, is a positive step and will hopefully lead to development of consistent regulation across much of the world. We've already got draft EU AI regulation, as Ansgar's mentioned, published and expected to become law on or around 2024. And it takes a risk-based approach and regulates broadly defined AI systems, which would capture, broad enough to capture software, algorithms, and AI-based products. And there are different rules for different categories of AI systems: unacceptable, high risk, and limited minimal risk. Most of the regulation relates to providers and users of high-risk AI systems. And similar to GDPR, the draft regulation will have extraterritorial effect and large fines for non-compliance. And it's certainly the most ambitious attempt yet at enforceable AI law. It's attracted mixed reviews, with some feeling that it should be much more person-centred, providing remedies for individuals adversely affected by AI systems, which it currently doesn't do. Closer to home in the UK, September 2021 saw the launch of the UK government's UK AI strategy, designed to make the UK a global AI superpower. The strategy identifies the need for a system of governance which fosters trust but also encourages innovation. Again, potential risks and harms associated with AI were highlighted, as was the potential for the current patchwork of UK multi-sector regulation to lead to overlap and inconsistencies. We're expecting a white paper shortly, which would be the first step in specific UK legislation, and it'll be interesting to see how much of the draft EU AI regulation footprint is followed. So I've used quite a lot of my time already, so let me break down the last bit to 5 simple provocations, which we can hopefully explore more in the Q&A. Why, what, where, when, and how of regulation. So the why, well, this session's entitled Ethics, Risk and Regulation. We were actually originally trying to do something clever with, to err as human and all that, but we didn't quite pull it off. But in any event, in short, the why is that there are always abuses of new technologies, whether intentional or not, and the scope for harm from AI abuses is very high. So principles and guidance are very useful, but they're not enough. What? Well, do we regulate AI systems like the EU AI regulation risk-based approach, or do we go for much more of a human-centred approach? Should we actually seek to create individual accountability for IT professionals who wield a tremendous amount of influence over as creators of these systems, but are essentially unregulated? And I'm thinking about something like, something akin to the senior managers regime in financial services, or the fit and proper person test for lawyers. Conscious that 3/4 of the lawyers, or half of the lawyers, are panels on this panel are lawyers. So, but should we regulate people and systems is really the question. And again, the question of when is probably easier. That needs to be soon or now, as AI systems are proliferating now. But it needs to be carefully considered regulation as technology develops, early enough to anticipate and address harms, but not so early as to stifle innovation completely, and that is a very tricky balance. The pace of development is always a challenge for lawmakers, and so, by the way, is the level of knowledge of those lawmakers, as Jen has mentioned. The where, well, one of the perennial challenges for lawmakers in a globalized economy is that laws are territorial and businesses are often not. The answer to the where question is that it needs to be everywhere to present the risk of rogue regimes and systems. So for example, again, GDPR has extraterritorial effect, and the same is being attempted with the draft AI regulation, and there'll be other examples. And the how. So for the how, we want progressive, proactive regulation. Fences at the top of the cliff preferred to ambulances at the bottom, recognizing that ambulances at the bottom are sometimes necessary. AI is so broad-ranging and multi-sectoral that effective regulation will be a huge challenge. Do we have something overarching, or a sectoral approach, or a bit of both? Maybe something like the Network and Information Security Systems Regulation approach, which has a kind of common framework with multiple sectoral regulators' oversight and additional sectoral rules, although I'm not actually convinced that has worked well in the case of NIS. And also, how do we balance carrot and stick? Is it certification schemes backed by legal force, so AI kite mark, if you will? Is it robust sanctions regimes for those who abuse, including individuals and organisations? Again, I suspect it will be a bit of both. So just to wrap up my opening remarks, the word regulation can often have negative connotations. I was hearing from a speaker earlier on in one of the earlier panels that apparently investors run a mile when they hear the word regulation. So it's sometimes red tape and box ticking, overtones. I would really encourage you and investors to think about this in a different way. If you've heard me speak before, then you may have understood how passionately I believe that we're now living in a trust economy. And obviously, Carolyn is Chief Trust Officer at Trustpilot. It's in our job title and our company name, so no pressure there. Trust is currency. It takes a lot of effort to amass, and it can be blown very quickly and easily. As AI systems become more complex, there's no way that you or I will understand all of the intricacies of how they work. So we have to inevitably put our trust in those who are designing and implementing those systems to look after our interests. Without that trust, whole technologies and markets will fail to achieve their potential. A carefully considered regulatory framework is essential to underpin that trust. We need to know that those who abuse that trust will be held to account. And it's also a way in which Scotland and the UK can differentiate itself in a competitive global economy. We won't outspend the Chinese or the US on AI research. So let's differentiate through trustworthiness and ethics by design. Principles and guidance like the OECD principles should be used not only by businesses but by lawmakers to ensure as consistent an approach as possible across territories to the promotion of ethical and trustworthy AI and meaningful sanctions for those who abuse. Invariably there will be deviation, but I'm looking forward to hearing from Caroline on how a global technology business with trust at its core goes about tackling that. And I'll speak to you again at the Q&A. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Callum, for posing those 5 questions, which would be a really nice way to frame the Q&A. And also just to encourage you, I think those of you who are participating remotely and also here in person, you can log on to the Q&A for this and start lining up the questions for us shortly. And now, as Callum has just mentioned, I'll hand over to our final speaker today, Carolyn Jameson, who is Chief Trust Officer at Trustpilot, and that is the most awesome job title I have ever heard, right? And an experienced business leader, having held a variety of roles covering corporate development, legal policy, and communications, all within technology sphere. She has a particular interest in emerging international regulatory policy in an online environment, given her experience scaling fast growth online businesses such as Skyscanner and Trustpilot. Carolyn will be sharing her reflections on how a major global technology business with trust at its core is approaching the issues outlined by our previous 2 speakers. Over to you, Carolyn.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me today. I'm particularly interested in your question on holding engineers accountable. I think I would love to tell them that and see how they respond. So, as you've heard, my role at the moment is Chief Trust Officer at Trustpilot, which does sound like a strange role. Seems to be whatever the founder doesn't fancy anymore, to be honest. But it's very varied and very interesting. But part of the role involves looking at how we detect fake reviews on the Trustpilot platform. And the content, also appropriateness of the content on the platform. And that is where Trustpilot is quite heavily involved in using machine learning and AI-based tools. And we opened an R&D centre here in Edinburgh last year, actually, or it might even be the year before that now, specifically to focus on that and how we can protect consumers through that. So we receive a significant number of reviews every year, 446.7 million this year alone. And so that means we have huge volumes of data, which is where our commercial advantage actually comes from in this space as well. Because what it lets us do is see really reliable patterns that help us to detect the fake reviews that might try and appear on the platform. And we have to be able to do that essentially because of the scale that we are getting new reviews. It wouldn't be possible for us ever to do that with anything apart from AI tools. We have a combined approach to detection of those. So every review has to go through our automated machine learning-based screening software. And that uses lots of multiple hundreds of data points to pull out reviews that would align to suspicious patterns of behavior that we've seen previously. So it could be things like timestamps, location data, device data, and we pull all of it together in a way that you couldn't really see that with the human eye, and that will automatically pull off reviews that we see as being suspicious. And then we also have other enhanced tools that we use. So one is anomaly detection. which is where we look at patterns. We train models to pull off reviews that have unusual patterns. So it could be things like, response rate to invitations, for example, if there's too many and the patterns look strange. And then that tool flags it to our fraud and investigations team, and we'll go and look into that in a lot of detail. And a really good example of this, just to try and bring it to life a little bit, would be in a media storm situation. So where consumers are called to go and do something to cause trouble for businesses or whatever, and leave reviews that aren't genuine on another social platform, and they'll come onto Trustpilot and potentially do that. We need to see that really quickly. We can't wait to spot that. And so the tools that we use flag that to us, and we go and look into it and stop it straight away. And then through the centre that we've opened up here, we also have a partner that we work with very closely called Pasabi, who are based in Codebase. And they look at broader behavioural patterns across the internet and social media. And they look at that alongside our data. And we look for patterns that suggest review selling behaviour, which is obviously the source of a lot of fake reviews. And what it lets us do is draw out clusters of behavioural activity across the web, and we can link review writers, review sellers, and review buyers, and that lets us draw a really good pattern there. So we then now are starting to also use this information to actually automate some of the action we take where we see these things happening. So it could be blocking profiles, it could be taking down particular reviews, it could be putting up warnings about particular businesses, and it could even involve taking legal action. So that's some of the work that we've been doing over the last few years. So as you can imagine, in the AI regulation space, it's something that we've been really closely monitoring. It's definitely of interest to us, given the types of technology that we're using. But I think of more interest to me is how that regulation could sit alongside some of the other regulation that we see upcoming in our space, because it's the conflict that potentially can arise, or which requirements should we be paying more attention to, that gives us the biggest headache, I suppose, as a tech company. There are certainly some areas that I'm more nervous of. So, for example, we will never be error-free as we use the AI technology, but, and this is a really good example of that conflict, we're seeing in new regulation proposed around how we manage content online, the expectations on us there are so high, we have to act very quickly. And our view is actually we should be acting quickly, and we'd prefer to protect people and be wrong than be too cautious. And it would be interesting to see how those two elements sit together, I think. But for any global technology company, and in my previous life at Skyscanner, we saw emerging regulation there as well. The key challenges arise where there are different countries and regulators with different approaches to the same issues. And it creates a real operational challenge for us to manage that, particularly if you want to grow internationally. And also it can do things like put potential investors off as well if it's a particularly complex area. So what I'm actually really encouraged to see here is that broad agreement at an internationally at principles level. I think that looks to be the case here more than I've seen historically in other areas. So I'm really pleased about that, and I hope it encourages more aligned legislation, which is often not the case. And maybe it's because we've learned something in recent years around the unintended consequences that we've seen and with technology, and the fact that lack of alignment has held us back in resolving some of those issues. I'm also encouraged to see the risk-based approach being proposed. And on that basis, as Trustpilot, I'm breathing a sigh of relief, because actually we are likely to be at the lower end of that spectrum at the moment, although we're obviously watching very closely. But I think that, combined with this concept of trustworthiness and the principles-based approach that everyone's taking, I think that's got to be the case here. Just the broad sectoral applicability of AI means it's impossible to come up with something that will work for everyone. And I think that's where we often see regulators and legislation fall down, where they try to do that. It just doesn't work. And we can't see the future, unfortunately. And I think working in that way allows us to then potentially let sectors develop solutions that are more appropriate for them, use working groups, things like that, which I know I've been a part of before and are actually quite effective. And then we will also reduce any negative impact on innovation, which is also the risk where we get legislation wrong. Now, I know Jen actually mentioned this, but this view that regulators don't understand is often something you hear. But actually, I don't think that's quite right. I've worked with regulators for a number of years, and I have come across some highly, highly intelligent people that work within regulators, economists and all sorts, and they do understand. And I think the biggest issue is more about how they find practical solutions to the problems, and that's where it falls down. You know, they're not a business, they're not working in a business, and they're trying to manage multiple stakeholders all the time, all of whom have different interests and can sometimes lead them down the wrong route actually as well sometimes. So I think what that means is it just takes far too long to reach any outcome from the point of view of regulation. And then by the time all these different factors have been brought into the consideration as they write it, it becomes ineffective. And that's where I've seen the biggest challenges in terms of regulation, and I think will be the biggest challenge here potentially too.
Thank you very much, Carol. So I'll just wait until the microphone comes back on. We good? Perfect. Thank you very much, Carolyn. So that leaves us with just shy of 10 minutes, maybe slightly longer if we squeak it, for some questions for the panel. There are some that have come through on the Q&A, and I think what we'll try and do is get at least one question for each of you. So starting perhaps with Callum or Ansgar. This question is, will regulation for AI be unstable unless there's a commonly accepted, understood, and stable definition of what's in scope for artificial intelligence? Would that be all machine learning, decision-making systems? And I'm going to add to that as well, because this was drawn out in both of your comments. And would you favor sort of a lighter touch or an in-the-bones approach? Do you think that's a sector-specific approach or something broader? So the question is, will it be unstable until we achieve common agreement? And if we are going to achieve common agreement based on your work, what approach would you be favoring here? And I'm happy to cede to either of you to start. Perhaps over to you, Ansgar, first.
Sure, happy to start off. So I think one thing that we're seeing is the question, should we be focusing any new regulation specifically on something that is of a machine learning type, something where this new type of AI is using a different way of establishing the model that drives this as opposed to how traditional software has worked? Or should it be an approach where we say, actually, we don't really care that much whether this is AI or it's just data analytics that was traditionally the case, because frankly, we care about the outcomes. And whether it was done by something AI or some kind of other software code doesn't really matter for the person who got harmed. And we're sort of seeing that push and pull happening even inside of the debates around the AI Act. The original position of the Commission having been, we should just not really care much about the technology side. We care about the use case and the implications. I think when we're looking at updates of sectoral regulation, often the focus is to say more, let's focus in on, is this a machine learning kind of approach that is different from what we've previously tried to regulate in this sector and try to identify. So it's perhaps not a hugely satisfying answer in that it's at this. It's also still very much, for instance, the focus of attention within the standard setting community as to what are the new challenges that actually are introduced in conformity assessment if we have a continuously learning type of system.
Thank you very much, Ansgar. And can I pass over to Callum for his thoughts as well on the same question?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Jen. Yeah, it's such a broad sector that I suppose I'm more concerned by too much specificity. I think there is a risk then that you start to cut out whole parts of the ecosystem or technologies. That does present a huge challenge for regulators, but I don't think we should underestimate the role of of the courts, for example, or particular regulatory decisions or guidance to try to bring more, put more flesh on the bones of principles. Personally, I think that the approach taken by the EU in the draft AI regulation is along the right lines. When we look at GDPR and how it's sometimes been criticised for not being specific enough and sort of putting in place a broad framework, I think that's absolutely necessary when you're doing something like this, and I think some of the flesh in the bones has to be added by guidance, sector-specific guidance, and also by precedent through courts. Because the danger is if you try and get too into the weeds, you risk all sorts of loopholes or cutting out parts of the ecosystem or particular technologies.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Callum. Sorry, I need to wait for the note. There we go. Thank you very much, Callum. And I think that probably, I mean, it's a pity that there isn't more time. I think this is just sort of the first steps, but actually some of the discussion and the questions have highlighted how much more there is to discuss. I want to shift slightly, though, to address something that Carolyn had raised earlier. There are a few questions in the chat really about from the industry side, how to tackle what is basically growing and overlapping requirements for compliance across not just this, but many different sectors and many different countries. So the question is that there's a challenge here about internal awareness within organizations of the need for AI governance. And it says, without going so far as the need for individual accountability, how do we encourage organizations to put governance frameworks in place? And then there's a linked question that maybe the other panel members can consider, which is about, as the regulatory landscape becomes more complex, how do we make compliance accessible or affordable for SMEs? But you could actually replace that as, for startups, basically for organizations that need to take a scaled approach, but to get the first steps right. So over to Carolyn first, and then maybe that systemic question over to Ansgar or Callum, if you'd like.
Well, there are lots in there. I actually think, so on the setting up of governance frameworks and how you manage different regulations in different countries, I actually think what is becoming more powerful than anything now in terms of that is the court of public opinion. And that's the best way that companies are held to account, because it's about behaving right and doing the right thing. And I think when companies realise that they need to do that, the consequences of not doing that are bad, then that encourages the right governance frameworks to be put in place and things to be taken seriously. I think enforcement and things like that through regulation, it's all very important, but it doesn't necessarily work as well because they have to identify that. It then takes time. Just that wanting to be seen in the public eye as doing the right thing, I think, is actually a powerful thing for companies now. And then how you manage different regulation. There does tend to be themes. So that's how I've always managed it. There are consistent themes. And then you just have to, definitely have public affairs type colleagues who will engage in some of the debate, try and influence, try and narrow down the differences as they're emerging, and that's been very useful in my experience. And then really focus on the key points and think about why. So what's at the root of it? What's the problem that they're trying to solve, and make sure that you are addressing that in your own business. In terms of information being accessible for startups, that's really hard. It is really hard. I think if you're in a particular sector and you're doing something in a startup that's quite cutting edge, you do need to take that responsibility and be aware up front of what you're getting into. And there is lots and lots of information available online. There is. Actually, some of the government websites are actually quite good for that. There's lots of detail there. And then there are lots of, I know I spend a lot of time helping startups. There are lots of other people in the community that will do that and get involved, whether it's for specific queries or on a more permanent basis. So I would encourage them to reach out, find the people with the expertise they need, and people are generally quite helpful.
Thank you very much, Carolyn. And I suppose I'll invite Ansgar and Callum to offer any further thoughts on that question, or just the question of the challenge that faces companies, big and small, at getting this right at this point in time. Ansgar, over to you first.
Sure, thank you. So I think we shouldn't underestimate the actual role that the developer environment plays when it comes to the actual creation of these systems. Nobody really sits down with a blank text processor to start writing code when it comes to anything around AI. We're all using tools around that, machine learning, ops systems, toolkits. Often the core functionality of these have been produced by the big tech companies. Actually, they create the libraries, etc. So as soon as we have clarity as to what the regulatory requirements are going to be, what are the things that you're going to have to document when it comes to the systems that you are building, these can then start to become integrated into these developer environments. And that can be something that will help any organization, no matter what their size is, to just make the process an integral part of the development cycle. You're not going back later on to try to identify what was our reasoning for justifying the use of these parameters, because as you were actually creating the system, you were prompted to make sure that you record all of these things. Creating the documentation is often one of the biggest sort of hurdles when it comes to the flow of the development, and one of the most missing elements when it comes to trying to assess these types of systems at the moment. And so just building that into the development environment can be a large piece of help, I think, for organizations, especially smaller ones.
I suppose I'm a big fan of toolkits and checklists, and I think, as Carolyn says, there's actually a lot of good stuff available on the web. It can be slightly overwhelming, but if you're going to, for example, the regulatory sources, so the AI toolkit from the Information Commissioner's Office, for example, is very helpful. I mean, I'm conscious of time, but I would just add one last remark, which is that very often, and it comes back to how I finished my opening remarks, I think companies approach this in the wrong way. So I know that SMEs have 1,000,001 things to think about, and you know, that sometimes it's just a small slice of everything. But I would see that, you know, regulatory compliance and ethics by design is a way of building value in the company early on. You've got a unique opportunity if you are at an earlier stage in a development life cycle to really create value. And if you know, we do a lot of technology investment work, for example, and the legals around that, and if investors or potential acquirers are doing due diligence, this is the first place that they now turn. They do privacy reviews, they do security reviews. Ethics reviews are not far, or some of the AI RA that Ansgar mentioned. These things are just around the corner. These are all value creators. So if you start to approach it in that way and build it in from the start, you're creating value for your business.
It's much harder to do it retrospectively.
Absolutely.
Excellent. So sadly, we need to wrap up just now. So it just falls to me to thank everyone for participating today, including your excellent questions in the Q&A. A special thank you to our panelists, Dr. Ansgar Kuhne, Callum Sinclair, and Carolyn Jameson, for your insight and your experience and your passion, actually, for this topic, and as well as the team at Data Lab and the Scotland's AI Strategy for their support at this summit. Just to summarize, as I said, I'm a bit of an amateur and a novice to this, but I have a growing interest in this field. And it is really interesting to hear the dedication and the foresight that has gone into really thinking about how to build these frameworks right out of that recognition that I think we all have and which resonates today, that technology has this potential to help us all do more and do better for people. I mean, I think that's why we're all here, really. And the question is how to get this right and to struggle with the challenges of encouraging innovation, but understanding that we're looking to regulate something that will grow beyond what we can imagine today. So from the panel, we're hopeful that our brief contribution has helped us to further this collective understanding of the challenges and maybe set some of you thinking as well about what to plan for in the future. And also by drawing on the sector and legal expertise and the experience of businesses like Trustpilot who are already navigating some of those challenges. We hope that together we can ensure that AI regulation is informed by the people with an understanding of these sectors, but also that those regulatory frameworks are grounded in ethical principles that speak to all of us, and that regulation is seen to and does operate for the good of all. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Okay, folks.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.